I was sitting on my front porch in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, enjoying my Saturday morning coffee when I saw her marching up my driveway like a general heading into battle. The woman was clutching a leather-bound folder against her chest, her mouth set in a thin line of disapproval, and I immediately knew this was going to be one of those days. "Excuse me, are you Robert Quinlan?" she demanded, not even bothering with pleasantries. "That's me," I said, setting down my coffee mug. "Can I help you?" "I'm Patricia Henderson, president of the Saguaro Hills Homeowners Association Board. We need to discuss several serious violations you've committed against our community covenants." She opened her folder with a dramatic flourish that would have been comical if her expression wasn't so severe. I'd only moved into this Phoenix suburb 3 months ago, after spending 22 years practicing land use and real estate law in downtown Phoenix. My wife had passed away 2 years prior, and I needed a fresh start somewhere quieter. The house was perfect, a modest ranch-style place with a decent yard, and I'd been keeping to myself mostly, just trying to settle in. "Violations?" I asked calmly. "What violations are those?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "First, your lawn is exactly 3.5 inches tall. Our covenants clearly state that grass must be maintained between 2 and 3 inches. Second, you've painted your mailbox post black when the approved color is forest green. Third, you have a garden gnome visible from the street, which violates our lawn ornament restrictions. And fourth, your garbage cans were visible from the street on Thursday morning after collection day." I took a slow sip of my coffee, studying this woman. She was probably in her late 50s, with severely styled blonde hair that looked like it required industrial-strength hairspray. Her outfit was what I'd call aggressively suburban: a pressed pink polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it and khaki capris that probably cost more than they should have. "I see," I said evenly. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm informing you that you have 72 hours to correct these violations or face fines of $100 per day per violation. That's $400 per day." She smiled tightly. "The covenants are very clear on this matter." "Could I see a copy of these covenants?" I asked. She pulled out a thick document from her folder and practically threw it at me. "Everything you need to know is in there. I suggest you read it carefully. We take our community standards very seriously here at Saguaro Hills." "I'll do that," I said. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Patricia seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't arguing with her. "See that you do, and Mr. Quinlan, we've had our eye on you. Some of the neighbors have mentioned that you keep odd hours, coming and going at all times of day and night. This is a family community, and we expect a certain level of decorum." That comment made my jaw tighten slightly. After my wife died, I'd developed insomnia. Some nights I'd drive around Phoenix for hours, just trying to clear my head. The idea that my grief-induced sleeplessness was somehow suspicious or inappropriate struck a nerve. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, my tone still pleasant but now with an edge to it. She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, and I sat there holding the covenant document, feeling that familiar itch I got when something wasn't quite right legally. I'd spent over 2 decades dealing with HOAs, zoning boards, municipal codes, and real estate disputes. I knew the law inside and out, and more importantly, I knew when someone was overreaching their authority. I spent the rest of Saturday afternoon reading through the covenants. The document was about 80 pages long, full of the usual HOA nonsense about paint colors, landscaping requirements, and architectural review processes. But as I read, I started noticing problems. Big problems. First, the covenant referenced several Arizona state statutes that had been amended or repealed over the past decade. Second, there were internal inconsistencies throughout the document. Section 12 stated that lawn ornaments under 18 inches were permitted, while Section 43 prohibited all lawn ornaments. Third, and most importantly, the amendment procedures outlined in the covenant hadn't been properly followed for at least 6 major changes made in the past 5 years. I pulled out my laptop and started doing some deeper research. I accessed the Maricopa County property records and pulled up the recorded documents for Saguaro Hills. What I found made me smile for the first time since Patricia had shown up at my door. The HOA had made significant amendments to the covenants in 2021, 2022, and 2023. According to the original 1997 covenants, any amendments required a vote of at least 67% of all homeowners, not just those present at a meeting. I pulled up the meeting minutes, which were public record, and found that the 2021 amendment had passed with only 42% of total homeowner approval. The 2022 and 2023 amendments were even worse, with less than 30% approval. In other words, the current covenants that Patricia was trying to enforce were legally invalid. But I wasn't done. I dug deeper into the HOA's financial records, which Arizona law required be available to homeowners. I submitted a formal request through the HOA's online portal Saturday evening, citing Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33-1728. which gave me the right to inspect HOA records within 10 business days. Sunday morning I was out in my yard with a tape measure, carefully documenting the height of my grass. It was indeed 3.5 inches, but I'd deliberately let it grow that tall because I'd read in a University of Arizona Extension Service bulletin that slightly taller grass was better for water conservation in the Arizona heat. I took photographs with timestamps, made notes, and treated it like I was preparing for trial, because in my experience that's exactly where these things often ended up. Monday morning my phone rang at 8:30. It was Patricia. "Mr. Quinlan, I'm calling to inform you that your request for financial records has been denied." "On what grounds?" I asked, already knowing this was coming. "The board has determined that you don't have a legitimate purpose for reviewing these records, and we consider your request to be harassment." "I see. And is this denial in writing?" "You'll receive a letter in the mail," she said curtly. "Furthermore, I'm calling to inform you that your 72 hours began Saturday morning at 9 a.m. You now have approximately 47 hours to correct your violation. I'd like to request a hearing before the board," I said. "Arizona law provides me that right before any fines are imposed." There was a pause. "A hearing?" "Yes. ARS 33, 17,209 specifically provides that an association must offer a hearing before imposing sanctions. I'd like to exercise that right." Another pause, longer this time. "Fine. The board meets Thursday evening at 7 p.m. You'll have 15 minutes to present your case. Actually, the statute doesn't impose a time limit on hearings. I'll need at least an hour." 15 minutes, Patricia repeated firmly. "Take it or leave it." "I'll be there," I said and hung up. I spent Monday and Tuesday preparing like I was going to argue before the Arizona Supreme Court. I drafted a 20-page memorandum outlining every legal deficiency in the HOA's position. I prepared exhibits, created a PowerPoint presentation, and pulled relevant case law. This wasn't just about my lawn anymore. This was about an HOA that had been operating outside the bounds of Arizona law probably for years, and homeowners who had been paying fines and following rules that weren't legally enforceable. Wednesday afternoon, I got a knock on my door. It was a man about my age, maybe early 50s, with a friendly face and tired eyes. "Hi, I'm Douglas Murphy. I live 3 houses down. I heard you're going before the board Thursday night. News travels fast," I said. "Patricia's been calling people, trying to drum up support. She's telling everyone you're a troublemaker who wants to turn the neighborhood into a junkyard." He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't know you, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia runs that board like her own personal fiefdom. She's gotten 3 families to move out in the past 2 years through harassment and fines. One guy had to declare bankruptcy partly because of HOA fines that got out of control." "Bankruptcy? That got my attention." "Over HOA fines?" $20,000 in fines over 18 months. They fined him for everything imaginable. He tried to fight it, but he couldn't afford a lawyer, and the board just kept piling on violations. "What happened to him?" "Lost his house eventually. Patricia made sure it went to foreclosure. Her brother-in-law bought it at auction for about 60 cents on the dollar." I felt my blood pressure rising. This wasn't just overzealous HOA enforcement, this was predatory behavior, possibly even fraudulent. "What's your story?" I asked Douglas. He sighed. "They fined me $5,000 last year because my roof shingles were supposedly the wrong shade of brown. I paid it because I couldn't afford to fight. I've got 2 kids in college." "Do you still have the documentation? The violation notice, the fine assessment, everything?" "Yeah, somewhere." "Why?" "Because I think Patricia and her board have been violating Arizona law, and I think I can prove it. But I'm going to need help from other homeowners." Douglas studied my face for a long moment. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Quinlan?" "Call me Robert, and I'm a land use attorney, or I was. I just retired after 22 years practicing in Phoenix." His eyes widened. "You're kidding." "Nope." And Patricia just picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. Thursday evening arrived, and I drove to the community center where the HOA board met. It was a nice facility, probably paid for with homeowner assessments, with a large meeting room that had a raised platform where the board sat behind a long table. About 30 homeowners were scattered around the room, and Patricia sat in the center of the board table like a queen on her throne. There were 4 other board members, 2 women who looked like they were Patricia's friends, an older man who seemed half asleep, and a younger guy in his 30s who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. They went through regular business first, approving meeting minutes, discussing a proposal to repaint the community center, and reviewing the landscaping budget for common areas. Then Patricia turned her attention to me. "We have a disciplinary hearing tonight, Mr. Robert Quinlan. Please come forward." I walked to the front of the room carrying my briefcase and a box of documents. "Mr. Quinlan, you've been granted 15 minutes to address the board regarding your violations. Your time starts now." "Actually," I said calmly, Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33, 17,209, subsection B, states that I'm entitled to a full and fair hearing. 15 minutes doesn't constitute a full and fair hearing when I have substantial evidence to present. I'll need at least an hour. Patricia's face flushed. We don't have an hour to waste on your excuses. It's not optional, Mrs. Henderson. It's Arizona law. If you refuse to provide adequate time, any sanctions you impose will be invalid and subject to reversal in court. You'll also be personally liable for my attorney's fees when I sue to overturn the sanctions. The younger board member, whose nameplate read Kevin Larson, leaned forward. Patricia, maybe we should hear him out. Fine, Patricia said through gritted teeth. You have 1 hour. I set up my laptop and connected it to the projector in the room. Thank you. Let's start with the violations I've been accused of. Mrs. Henderson claims my lawn is 3.5 inches tall, which allegedly violates the covenant. However, there are several problems with this assertion. I pulled up my first slide, which showed a photograph of my lawn with a ruler clearly visible. First, as you can see, my grass is indeed 3.5 inches. However, I'd like to direct the board's attention to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the covenants, which states that lawns must be maintained in a healthy and attractive condition. It doesn't specify a precise height requirement, Patricia interrupted. Section 41 clearly states 2 to 3 inches. I'm getting to that, I said. Section 41 was added as an amendment in 2021. However, that amendment was never properly ratified according to the procedures outlined in Article 15 of the original 1997 covenants. Article 15 requires 67% approval of all homeowners, not just those present at a meeting. According to the meeting minutes from April 2021, only 132 homeowners voted in favor of the amendment out of 314 total homes in Saguaro Hills. That's 42%, well short of the required 67%. I watched as the color drained from Patricia's face. Therefore, I continued, Section 41 is invalid and unenforceable. The same is true for approximately 37 other amendments made between 2021 and 2023, none of which received proper approval. I clicked to the next slide. Let's move on to the mailbox. Mrs. Henderson claims I painted my mailbox post black when forest green is required. However, when I purchased this property 3 months ago, the mailbox post was already black. I have photographs from the real estate listing to prove it. The post has been black since at least 2019, which I confirmed through Google Street View historical images. I showed the images on screen and several homeowners in the audience started murmuring. Furthermore, I said, the forest green requirement comes from the same invalid 2021 amendment. Under the original 1997 covenants, mailbox color isn't specified at all. Patricia was gripping the edge of the table now, her knuckles white. Now let's discuss the garden gnome. Mrs. Henderson claims it violates lawn ornament restrictions. However, Section 12 of the original covenants explicitly permits lawn ornaments under 18 inches. My gnome is 14 inches tall. I measured it. I pulled out the actual gnome from my box and set it on the table in front of the board with a tape measure. Several people in the audience laughed. Finally, the garbage can issue. Mrs. Henderson claims my cans were visible from the street on Thursday after collection. Arizona law requires that waste collection services have access to garbage cans, and the city of Phoenix requires cans be placed at the curb. The covenants state that cans must be removed from the curb by end of business on collection day. Collection day was Wednesday. I removed my cans Wednesday at 6 p.m. before the alleged violation. I showed a timestamp photo from my phone showing the cans back in my side yard. So in summary, none of the alleged violations are valid. But here's where it gets interesting. I clicked to a new slide showing a financial spreadsheet. I submitted a request to review the HOA's financial records on Saturday, which is my right under ARS 33-1728. Mrs. Henderson denied that request on Monday, which is a violation of Arizona law. However, as a homeowner, I'm entitled to review records filed with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, which I did. The next slide showed a series of transactions. Over the past 3 years, this HOA has collected over $478,000 in fines and late fees. That's separate from regular assessments. Now, where did that money go? I clicked again. According to county records, the HOA hired a property management company called Desert Horizons Management. That company is owned by Patricia Henderson's husband, Mark Henderson. Desert Horizons receives 10% of all fines collected as a management fee. In other words, Mrs. Henderson has a direct financial incentive to impose as many fines as possible on homeowners. The room erupted. People were shouting questions, and Patricia was on her feet. "This is slander," she yelled. "You have no right to make these accusations." "It's not slander if it's true and documented," I said calmly. "I have copies of all the business filings. Mark Henderson is listed as the registered agent for Desert Horizons Management. You're listed as an officer of the company. And here's the real problem. Arizona law requires board members to disclose conflicts of interest. You never disclose this arrangement to the homeowners. Kevin Larson looked shocked. Patricia, is this true? I don't have to answer to him, Patricia said, pointing at me. Actually, you do, I said. Because what you've been doing isn't just unethical, it's potentially criminal. ARS 13-1802 defines theft as knowingly controlling another person's property with intent to deprive them of it. You've been imposing invalid fines under invalid covenants, collecting money based on those fines, and funneling 10% of that money to a company you and your husband own. That's theft by fraud. The room went completely silent. Furthermore, I continued, I spoke with several homeowners this week who've been victims of your enforcement actions. Douglas Murphy, would you stand up, please? Douglas stood up in the back of the room. Mr. Murphy was fined $5,000 last year for roof shingles that were allegedly the wrong color. I reviewed his file. The violation notice didn't specify what color the shingles should be or provide any evidence that they violated the covenants. He paid the fine because he couldn't afford to fight it. I believe he's entitled to a full refund with interest. Another woman stood up. She fined me $3,000 because my rose bushes were supposedly too tall. I had to take out a loan to pay it. More people started standing, sharing their stories. Patricia's face had gone from red to pale white. I want a vote, Kevin Larson said suddenly. I move that we suspend Patricia Henderson from the board pending a full investigation into these allegations. Second, said one of the other board members. The older man, who'd seemed half asleep but now looked very alert. You can't do this, Patricia shouted. Actually, we can, Kevin said. Article 8 of the bylaws allows the board to suspend a member for cause by majority vote. All in favor? 3 hands went up. Only Patricia's 2 friends abstained. Motion carries, Kevin said. Patricia, you're suspended from the board effective immediately. We'll be hiring an independent attorney to review all of this. Patricia grabbed her folder and her purse. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, with homeowners asking questions, demanding refunds, and sharing their own stories about Patricia's enforcement actions. Kevin Larson asked me to stay after to discuss next steps. This is a disaster, Kevin said, running his hands through his hair. How did it get this bad? People were afraid to fight back, I said. HOAs can be intimidating, especially if you don't know the law. Patricia took advantage of that. What should we do now? First, hire an attorney who specializes in HOA law to do a complete review of the covenants and all enforcement actions from the past 3 years. Second, put a moratorium on all fines until that review is complete. Third, send a letter to every homeowner explaining what happened and offering them a chance to appeal any fines they've paid. Fourth, and this is important, report this to the Arizona Attorney General's office. If there's been fraud, it needs to be investigated properly. Kevin nodded, taking notes. Would you be willing to help? I mean, as an attorney? I'm retired, I said, but I'll help as a homeowner. I live here too, and I want this community to be run properly. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved quickly. The board hired a law firm out of Scottsdale to review everything. They confirmed what I'd found. Dozens of amendments had been improperly ratified, fines had been imposed without proper authority, and Patricia had never disclosed her conflict of interest regarding Desert Horizon's management. The board voted to invalidate all fines imposed under the invalid amendments and issued refunds totaling over $300,000. They also terminated the contract with Desert Horizon's management and hired a reputable property management company with no connections to any board members. But Patricia wasn't done. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Phoenix. Patricia was suing me for defamation, claiming I'd damaged her reputation by making false statements about her conduct as HOA president. I read the complaint and actually laughed. It was one of the worst drafted legal documents I'd seen in my career. The attorney who wrote it clearly didn't specialize in defamation law and had made several basic errors. First, truth is an absolute defense to defamation. Everything I'd said at that board meeting was documented and provable. Second, statements made during official proceedings like HOA meetings are generally protected by qualified privilege. Third, Patricia was arguably a public figure in the context of the HOA, which meant she'd have to prove actual malice, a much higher standard. I called a former colleague of mine, Rebecca Chen, who now specialized in defamation defense. Rebecca, I need your help with something, and I think you're going to enjoy this. I sent her the complaint and all my documentation. She called me back an hour later, laughing. Robert, this is the weakest defamation case I've seen in years. I'll take it, but I don't think it'll last long. She was right. Rebecca filed a motion to dismiss under Arizona's anti-SLAPP statute, which provides special protections for people who get sued for speaking out on matters of public concern. We included all my documentation as exhibits. The business filings showing Patricia's ownership of Desert Horizon's management, the county records showing improper amendment procedures, and the financial records showing the flow of money from fines to her company. The judge granted our motion within 30 days and awarded me attorney's fees. Patricia was ordered to pay $15,000 to cover Rebecca's fees, but the real consequence came from the Arizona Attorney General's office. They'd opened an investigation after the board filed a complaint, and they didn't like what they found. In addition to the HOA issues, investigators discovered that Desert Horizons Management had never been properly licensed as a property management company in Arizona, which is required by law. They also found evidence that Patricia and her husband had been skimming money from the HOA's reserve fund through fraudulent invoices for maintenance work that was never performed. On a warm Tuesday morning in May, about 3 months after Patricia had first shown up at my door, I watched from my porch as 2 Phoenix Police Department detectives knocked on her door. They arrested her and her husband on charges of fraud, theft, and operating an unlicensed property management business. Douglas Murphy walked over while I was watching. "Hard to believe," he said. She seemed so convinced she was right about everything. "That's the problem with people like Patricia," I said. "They get a little bit of power and convince themselves they're above the rules." She thought she could intimidate everyone into compliance. She picked the wrong guy to mess with. I smiled. I spent 22 years dealing with people who thought they could ignore the law. She was just another bully with a title. The criminal case against Patricia and her husband took about 8 months to work through the system. They both eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges. Patricia got 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and had to pay restitution of over $200,000. Her husband got a similar sentence. They ended up selling their house in Saguaro Hills and moving out of state. The HOA itself underwent major reforms. The board hired a professional parliamentarian to help them properly amend the covenants, and this time they did it right. They held town halls, explained all proposed changes, and got the required 67% approval. The new covenants were reasonable. They maintained basic aesthetic standards but eliminated most of the nitpicky rules Patricia had tried to impose. They also implemented new financial controls requiring an independent audit every year and full transparency on all spending. Kevin Larson became the new president, and he actually did a decent job. The HOA went from being the neighborhood terror to being a functional organization that maintained common areas and organized community events. As for me, I finally started to feel at home in Saguaro Hills. My lawn stayed at a healthy 3.5 inches. My mailbox post remained black, and my 14-inch garden gnome kept watch over my front flower bed. Nobody complained. I even got to know my neighbors better. Douglas Murphy and his wife invited me over for dinner. Other homeowners would stop by to chat when I was working in the yard. Turns out when people aren't living in fear of arbitrary fines and harassment, they're actually pretty friendly. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after the whole situation had resolved, I was sitting on my porch with my coffee when a moving truck pulled up to Patricia's old house. A young couple got out, looking excited and nervous. They had a baby in a car seat and a golden retriever on a leash. The woman, who looked to be in her late 20s, noticed me and waved. I waved back. A few minutes later, she walked over, the dog pulling her along. "Hi, I'm Natalie Kowalski. We're moving in today. Robert Quinlan. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thanks. We're so excited. We heard this is a great community." The dog was jumping up, trying to get my attention, and I reached down to pet him. "It's gotten better recently," I said. "There was some drama with the HOA, but it's sorted out now." "Oh, we heard something about that. The realtor mentioned there'd been some kind of investigation, but she said everything was fine now." "Everything is fine now," I confirmed. "New board, new rules, and everyone's a lot happier. That's good to hear." "My husband and I were worried about HOA horror stories. You know how they can be." I smiled. "I do know, but you'll be fine here. If you ever have any questions about the HOA or the covenants, feel free to ask. I've gotten pretty familiar with them." "I will, thanks." She headed back to her house, the dog bouncing along beside her. I watched them start unloading boxes, thinking about how different this neighborhood was now compared to a year ago. Patricia had created an environment of fear and control, where homeowners were afraid to plant flowers or paint their fence without worrying about getting fined. Now it was just a regular suburban neighborhood where people could live their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had threatened to sue me over 1/2 inch of grass, a garden gnome, and a black mailbox post. She'd thought she held all the power, that she could intimidate me into compliance like she had so many others. She had no idea I'd spent 22 years of my life studying land use law, real estate regulations, and HOA governance. She'd literally picked a fight with the one person in Saguaro Hills who was uniquely qualified to dismantle everything she'd built. That evening, the HOA organized a community barbecue at the park, one of their new regular events. I wandered over around 6, and the place was packed. Kevin was manning the grill, Douglas was setting up tables, and kids were running around playing tag. The whole neighborhood had turned out. "Robert," Kevin called when he saw me. "Grab a plate, we've got burgers and hot dogs." I loaded up a plate and found a spot at one of the picnic tables. A woman I recognized from the board meeting sat down across from me. "You're the lawyer who took down Patricia, right?" she asked. "I'm a lawyer, yes." Though I'd say she took herself down. I just pointed out what she'd been doing. "Well, whatever you did, thank you. She fined me $2,000 3 years ago because my house number wasn't the right font." The right font! I was getting ready to fight it. But then I heard about what happened to that guy who went bankrupt, and I just paid it. I was so angry. "Did you get your money back?" "Every penny, plus interest." I can't tell you what a relief that was. Similar conversations happened throughout the evening. Person after person came up to thank me, to share their stories about Patricia's reign of terror, and to express relief that things had changed. It was gratifying in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent my career helping clients with zoning disputes and land use issues, but this felt more personal. These were my neighbors, my community. As the sun set over the Phoenix suburbs, turning the sky brilliant shades of orange and purple, I sat there eating a burger and watching kids play in the park. Douglas sat down next to me. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Patricia always said she was protecting the community, maintaining standards, keeping property values up. But property values actually dropped during her time on the board. Too many people wanted out. Now they're climbing again. Fear and intimidation aren't great for building community," I said. "No kidding. Hey, I wanted to ask you something. The board is thinking about updating the architectural review process, making it clearer and more transparent. Would you be willing to review the proposal before we present it to homeowners? Just to make sure we're not missing anything legally?" "Sure, I can do that." "Great. And Robert, you should think about joining the board. We could use someone with your knowledge." I shook my head. "I'm retired, Douglas. I did my time. You all are doing fine without me." "Fair enough, but the offer stands." Over the following months, I settled into a comfortable routine. I worked in my garden, which had become something of a showcase after I'd put in a xeriscaping design with native Arizona plants. I took up woodworking in my garage, building furniture and birdhouses. I even started dating a woman named Sarah who worked at the local library, something I hadn't thought I'd be ready for after losing my wife. The legal aftermath of Patricia's downfall continued for quite a while. Several homeowners filed civil suits against her and her husband seeking additional damages beyond the HOA refunds. Most settled out of court. The Arizona Attorney General's office also went after Desert Horizons Management, shutting down the company and imposing significant fines. There was even an investigation into whether other HOAs in the Phoenix area had similar issues with board members having undisclosed financial interests. It turned out Patricia's scheme wasn't unique. The Attorney General's office ended up creating new guidelines for HOA governance and transparency in Arizona. I got called to testify at a few of the civil proceedings, and at one point was asked to speak at a continuing legal education seminar about HOA law and governance. I'd retired from practicing law, but apparently I'd become something of an accidental expert on HOA corruption. "How did you know to look into the property management company connection?" an attorney asked me during the seminar. "Experience," I said. In 22 years of land use practice, I learned that when someone is being unreasonably aggressive about enforcement, there's usually a financial motive. Follow the money and you'll find the problem, but most homeowners wouldn't know to do that. No, they wouldn't. That's why these schemes work. HOA boards have a lot of power, and most people don't understand the law well enough to challenge them. Patricia had been getting away with it for years because her victims didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back. The seminar led to some consulting work with other HOAs that wanted to clean up their governance practices. I didn't charge much, just enough to cover my time, because I'd come to see it as something of a public service. Too many people were getting taken advantage of by boards that operated more like fiefdoms than community organizations. About 18 months after the initial confrontation with Patricia, I got a call from Kevin Larson. "Robert, I wanted to give you a heads up. We're having a special recognition ceremony at next month's annual meeting. The board voted unanimously to give you an award for your service to the community." "That's really not necessary," I said. "I know, but we want to do it anyway. You saved a lot of people a lot of money and grief. Just show up and let us say thank you properly." The annual meeting was held at the community center on a Saturday afternoon. I showed up expecting a plaque or maybe a gift card, something simple. Instead, I walked into a room full of homeowners who gave me a standing ovation. Kevin presented me with a custom-made wooden sign for my yard that read, "Saguaro Hills Citizen of the Year." It was actually beautiful, made by a local woodworker, with intricate carving and a clear coating that would hold up to the Arizona sun. "Robert Quinlan moved to our community last year," Kevin said to the crowd, and within months he'd uncovered a pattern of corruption and abuse that had been going on for years. He could have just paid the fines and kept his head down like so many others did. Instead, he stood up not just for himself but for all of us. Thanks to his efforts, over $300,000 in invalid fines were returned to homeowners. More importantly, he helped us transform this HOA from an organization that homeowners feared into one that actually serves the community. Thank you, Robert. More applause. I felt my face getting red, which was unusual for me. I'd argued cases in front of judges, given presentations to planning commissions, and negotiated complex real estate deals, but this simple recognition from my neighbors meant more than any of that. Thank you, I said when the applause died down. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this alone. Every homeowner who came forward with their story, every person who attended board meetings and demanded transparency, every board member who voted to investigate and make changes, you all did this. I just had some legal knowledge that helped get the ball rolling. The real heroes are the people who stood up even though they were afraid, who demanded better even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. After the meeting, there was a reception with cake and punch. People kept coming up to thank me, to update me on their lives, to tell me how much better things were now. Natalie Kowalski, the young woman who'd moved into Patricia's old house, approached with her husband. "We heard all about what you did," she said. "That's amazing. We almost didn't buy the house because we were worried about HOA problems. But our realtor convinced us the community had turned things around." "It has," I said. "You made a good choice and we love the neighborhood. Everyone's been so welcoming." That was the real measure of success, I thought. New families moving in, excited about the community instead of afraid of it. As I drove home that afternoon with the wooden sign on my passenger seat, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 2 years ago, I'd been grieving my wife, burned out from decades of legal practice, just looking for a quiet place to finish out my years in peace. Instead, I'd found a community that needed help, and in helping them, I'd found a new purpose. I installed the sign in my front yard that evening, right next to my 14-inch garden gnome. My lawn was a healthy 3.5 inches tall, my mailbox post was still black, and everything was exactly as it should be. Monday morning, I was back on my front porch with my coffee when I saw a familiar sight. A woman was walking down the sidewalk looking at houses with a critical eye. For a moment, I tensed, wondering if we had another Patricia situation developing. Then she saw me and waved. "Good morning, I'm looking for Robert Quinlan." "That's me," I said, setting down my coffee mug. She walked up to my porch. "I'm Jennifer Morrison. I'm on the board of Sonoran Vista HOA, about 5 miles from here. We heard about what you did at Saguaro Hills, and we were wondering if you'd be willing to review our covenants. We've had some concerns about our board president, and we want to make sure everything is legal before we raise any issues." I smiled. "Why don't you have a seat? Let's talk about what's going on." As she settled into the chair next to me and pulled out a folder full of documents, I realized that retirement wasn't going to be quite as quiet as I'd planned, but that was okay. After 22 years as a land use attorney, I'd learned that the law was supposed to protect people, not be used as a weapon against them. If I could help more communities avoid what Saguaro Hills had gone through, that was time well spent. My phone rang while Jennifer was explaining her HOA's issues. It was Rebecca Chen, my attorney friend. "Robert, I've got 3 more homeowners who want to talk to you about HOA problems. Word is spreading. You might want to think about coming out of retirement officially." "I am retired," I said firmly, "but I'll talk to them as a consultant. No courtrooms, no trials, just advice." "That's what you said last time, and look how that turned out," Rebecca said with a laugh. She had a point. But as I sat there on my porch, listening to Jennifer describe her board president's behavior, which sounded remarkably similar to Patricia's pattern, I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. 22 years of legal experience had taught me how the system worked, how to find the loopholes, how to hold people accountable when they abused their power. Patricia had threatened to sue me over a garden gnome, not knowing she was picking a fight with someone who'd spent more than 2 decades mastering the exact areas of law she'd been violating. The irony still made me smile. She'd come marching up to my door with her leather folder and her threats, so confident in her authority, so certain she could intimidate me into compliance. She never thought to ask what I did for a living, never considered that her target might actually know more about HOA law than she did. It was a reminder of something I'd learned early in my legal career. Bullies rely on people not fighting back. They count on intimidation working, on their victims not having the knowledge or resources to challenge them. Patricia had gotten away with her scheme for years because most homeowners didn't know enough about the law to realize what she was doing was illegal. But I did know. And once I'd exposed her scheme, once homeowners understood they had rights and the law was on their side, the whole house of cards collapsed. Jennifer finished explaining her situation, and I made some notes about what documents I'd need to review. As she left, promising to send everything over by email, Douglas Murphy walked by walking his dog. "Another HOA problem?" he asked, nodding toward Jennifer's retreating back. "Looks like it. Apparently, we've become the case study for how to fix corrupt HOAs." "You've become that case study," Douglas corrected. "The rest of us just benefited from living next door to the right person at the right time." "Wrong person for Patricia, though," Douglas laughed. "Yeah, she really should have checked your background before she decided to threaten you with lawsuits. Worst mistake she ever made." After Douglas moved on, I sat there finishing my coffee and thinking about how much had changed in just 18 months. Saguaro Hills had gone from a community living in fear of their HOA to a neighborhood where people actually participated in governance, where board meetings had constructive discussions instead of hostile confrontations, where homeowners felt empowered instead of intimidated. And it had all started because Patricia Henderson saw my lawn was half an inch too tall and decided that was worth starting a war over. She'd threatened fines, threatened lawsuits, threatened to make my life miserable. She'd tried to use the covenants as a weapon, never realizing those covenants were invalid and her enforcement actions were illegal. In the end, Patricia lost everything: her position on the board, her property management company, her reputation, and nearly her freedom. She and her husband had to pay back hundreds of thousands of dollars, complete community service, and leave the neighborhood in disgrace. All because she'd gotten greedy and thought she was above the law. Meanwhile, I'd gained something I hadn't expected: a sense of community and purpose. I'd helped my neighbors, used my legal knowledge for something that felt meaningful, and in the process I'd found a new direction for my retirement years. My phone buzzed with an email from Jennifer Morrison. Subject line: Sonoran Vista HOA documents for review. I opened it and started downloading the attachments. Might as well take a look, I thought. As I reviewed the documents on my laptop, sitting on my front porch in the warm Arizona sunshine, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful that I'd moved to Saguaro Hills. Grateful that Patricia had been arrogant enough to threaten me. Grateful that I'd had the knowledge and experience to fight back. 22 years as a land use attorney hadn't just been a career. It had been preparation for exactly this moment, for exactly this fight. Patricia Henderson had thought she was dealing with just another homeowner she could bully into submission. Instead, she'd run headfirst into someone who'd spent more than 2 decades learning exactly how to take apart people like her. And in the end, justice had prevailed. The corrupt board was gone, homeowners had their money back, and Saguaro Hills was finally the kind of community it should have been all along. Not a bad outcome for a confrontation that started over half an inch of grass and a garden gnome. I finished reviewing the Sonoran Vista documents and started drafting my analysis. Their situation was similar to what we'd dealt with at Saguaro Hills: invalid amendments, conflicts of interest, and a board president who seemed to think the HOA existed to serve her rather than the homeowners. This one was going to be easier, though. I now had a template for how to handle these situations, a roadmap for how to investigate, document, and ultimately reform an HOA that had lost its way. Jennifer and her fellow homeowners wouldn't have to go through the same learning curve I did. As the afternoon sun moved across the sky, I kept working, making notes, identifying the key issues, preparing recommendations. It was exactly the kind of work I'd done for clients for 22 years, but somehow it felt different doing it for neighbors and community members rather than corporate clients. My 14-inch garden gnome kept watch over the yard, a silent reminder of where this all started. That little ceramic figure had been part of Patricia's list of violations, proof that I was supposedly ruining the neighborhood with my flagrant disregard for community standards. Now it stood as a symbol of something else: the importance of standing up to bullies, of knowing your rights, of refusing to be intimidated by people who abuse their authority. Patricia had seen it as a violation. I saw it as the beginning of justice for an entire community. The sun was setting by the time I finished my analysis and sent it off to Jennifer Morrison. Another HOA crisis potentially averted. Another group of homeowners armed with the knowledge they needed to protect their rights. I leaned back in my chair and watched the Arizona sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. My lawn was 3.5 inches tall, exactly where I wanted it. My mailbox post was black, just as it had been when I bought the house. My garden gnome stood proudly in the flower bed, and my garbage cans were safely stored in my side yard. Everything was exactly as it should be. And somewhere out there, Patricia Henderson was probably thinking about the day she'd marched up to my door with her leather folder and her threats, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. She'd threatened to sue me, tried to fine me hundreds of dollars per day, and attempted to make me an example to intimidate other homeowners into compliance. She'd wielded the HOA covenants like a weapon, confident in her power and authority. But she hadn't known I'd been a land use attorney for 22 years. She hadn't known I'd spent over 2 decades mastering the exact laws she'd been violating. She hadn't known that her threats and intimidation would be met not with fear, but with the precise application of legal knowledge and documented evidence, and that made all the difference.